Dr. Elliot Klein leaned over his console, eyes glued to the stream of data flowing across his screen. Light from the monitor cast sharp shadows on his face, illuminating the weariness he carried after weeks in the dark void of space. The Perseus, a research vessel stationed just outside the Kuiper Belt, was far from any known object, designed to monitor deep space anomalies. The mission was supposed to be routine. But there, alone in the silence, Elliot sensed something was wrong. It began as a faint, almost imperceptible blip, nothing more than static interspersed with irregular pulses. But the sound felt wrong somehow, like a heartbeat flickering in and out of sync with his own. He watched the pulse repeat, an eerie rhythm that became clearer with every loop. The static grew sharper, almost whispering at the edge of his mind, and instinctively, he reached for his communicator. "Command, are you seeing this?" His voice trembled slightly. Silence. The comms were clear, yet Command remained silent, leaving Elliot with the persistent blip that seemed to grow louder, pressing against the walls of his mind. He shifted in his seat, hands clenched, and tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. The blip had a frequency, a rhythm that burrowed into his mind, resonating with an odd familiarity. He knew somehow that this was no ordinary signal. It wasn't the usual cosmic noise, nor was it a relic of humanity's distant broadcasts echoing back across the cosmos. This signal felt alive. Elliot sent a message to the rest of the crew, summoning them to the lab. They arrived quickly, a mix of curiosity and irritation in their eyes. Captain Harper, grim-faced as always. Dr. Lyra Sanchez, the quiet xenobiologist with a knack for making everyone feel uneasy. And Julian Novak, the young engineer whose bravado masked a quiet fear of the deep unknown. They gathered around, staring at the waveform that danced across the console. "Is it a solar anomaly?" Harper asked, narrowing her eyes. Elliot shook his head. "It's far too complex. And it's repeating itself, but in subtle variations. Almost like it's waiting." "Waiting?" Lyra asked, her brow furrowing. "Yes. As if it wants something from us," Elliot replied, swallowing hard. The words tasted strange, even to him. They listened in silence as the signal played on, a pulsing rhythm with an edge that seemed to reverberate through their bones. Julian muttered something under his breath, barely audible, and stared at the display as if transfixed. "What did you say?" Lyra asked, glancing at him. "Nothing. Just, it almost sounds like—" Julian trailed off, shaking his head, unable to articulate the crawling sensation that ran down his spine. The Perseus isolation amplified the discomfort. The nearest human was millions of miles away. There was no cavalry, no backup, only the quiet hum of the ship and the ominous pulse echoing through their minds. Days passed, and the signal only grew stronger. It seeped into every part of their routine, a constant presence like a slow poison in the air. Conversations grew short and tense, meals went untouched, and sleep became a forgotten luxury. They took turns trying to decipher the signal, scrutinizing it for patterns, analyzing its source. It was coming from a fixed point, a dead zone at the farthest reaches of the Kuiper Belt. The data suggested it was from an object, a massive monolithic structure drifting in a sector they had previously marked as empty space. Empty seemed a laughable word now. As they listened, they began hearing things, subtle whispers in the empty corridors, static crackling in the middle of sentences. The signal, like a growing infection, had taken root, wrapping itself around their minds, compelling them to understand it. "Do you ever feel like it's calling to you?" Lyra asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared into the darkness of the ship's observation deck. Elliot nodded, though he was hesitant to admit it. The others had felt it too. They couldn't explain the connection, but it was there, pulling them deeper into its mystery. "It feels ancient," Julian said one night, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Like it's been waiting here, watching. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's like it's thinking." A chill ran through Elliot, and he knew the others felt it too. They had stumbled upon something greater, something beyond humanity's reach or understanding. He found himself obsessing over the signal, watching its pulse shift and warp, mesmerized by its alien cadence. It consumed him, gnawing at the corners of his mind with a relentless hunger, filling his thoughts, his dreams, even his waking moments. It was only a matter of time before he started hearing the whispers in his own mind. Then, on the 7th day, Elliot experienced his first blackout. He had been sitting in the observation deck, transfixed by the stars, when a void seemed to swallow him whole. His mind went blank, and when he came to, he was standing by the console with no memory of how he got there. He wasn't alone. Lyra was beside him, staring at the data screen, her face pale, her expression vacant. You were saying something," she whispered, not looking away from the screen. "Something in another language." "What?" Elliot asked, his voice hoarse. But she offered no explanation, only a haunted look that mirrored his own growing terror. As the days stretched on, the blackouts became more frequent. Elliot and the crew found themselves drawn to the console, muttering words they didn't understand, staring at the signal with blank, hollow expressions. They were no longer in control. The signal had sunk its claws deep, pulling them towards the dark promise it held. Desperation crept into their voices when they spoke to command, but the responses grew less frequent, scattered with static and punctuated by strange sounds that felt more like echoes of the signal than human communication. Elliot knew with a dreadful certainty that something was manipulating their messages, blocking their transmissions, isolating them even further. "Do you think we should just turn back?" Julian asked one night, his voice trembling as he glanced at the empty blackness outside. "We can't," Elliot replied, the words leaving his mouth before he even realized he'd spoken them. It was as if something else had answered on his behalf. The others fell silent, an unspoken agreement passing among them. They couldn't leave, wouldn't leave. The signal wouldn't let them. As the darkness of space closed in around them, they became more like specters than scientists, hollowed by sleepless nights and haunted by the ceaseless, insidious rhythm of that unholy beat. The knowledge gnawed at Elliot, a quiet but undeniable truth that grew louder with each pulse of the signal. They had found something vast, something alien, and in their naive curiosity, they had awakened it. They were alone in the dark, millions of miles from home, with only the whispers of the unknown and the terrible certainty that this signal was no discovery. It was a trap. And so, with nothing left to hope for, the crew of the Perseus continued their dreadful vigil, drawn ever closer to the unseen source of the signal. Each heartbeat of the pulse pulling them further into the darkness, where something waited, a presence as old as time itself, watching, hungering, and reaching for them through the void. Elliot Klein's fingers hovered over the controls, a bead of cold sweat rolling down his temple. The Perseus had drifted close enough for their scanners to capture the object that emitted the strange, haunting signal. But even with the feed, what they saw made no sense. It was a structure, undeniably artificial, but alien beyond comprehension. It hung in the void like a mausoleum, a dark shape that devoured the starlight around it, casting an unnatural shadow across the cosmos. "Is it alive?" Julian murmured, his face pale as he adjusted the feed. The object pulsed faintly, resonating with the signal that had poisoned their minds for days. Each pulse felt like an invisible hand tugging them forward, drawing them closer. The structure was massive, organic, yet mechanical, its surface a twisted lattice of bone-like ridges and metallic veins that seemed to breathe. Thin strands of what looked like petrified tendrils spiraled outward, stretching into space, as though it were trying to ensnare everything that wandered too close. The crew watched, horrified, as it moved imperceptibly, a dark star writhing in slow, silent agony. "Are we really doing this?" Lyra's voice was barely a whisper, trembling as she stared at the monstrous form on the monitor. Despite her voice, Elliot could see something else, a gleam in her eyes that mirrored his own conflicted dread and curiosity. She too felt the call. "We don't have a choice," Captain Harper replied, though her voice held no authority. There was an emptiness in her words, a resignation. They all knew, on some deep level, that the decision was not theirs. The signal demanded their approach, their presence. Under a compulsion they barely understood, the Perseus' thrusters shifted, guiding them toward a docking point, an aperture that resembled an open, waiting mouth. As they neared, their vision blurred, and a prickling sensation washed over them, as though the ship itself was crossing an invisible threshold. Elliot's pulse quickened, matching the rhythm of the signal. A rhythm that felt closer to a heartbeat now, something vast and predatory, lurking just beyond their senses. The aperture was more massive than they'd realized. As they entered, the crew fell silent, breath held in awe and terror. The passage was lined with a strange, glistening substance that looked almost organic, like the flesh of an immense creature. The walls pulsed and rippled as if breathing, and a low hum filled the air, vibrating through their bones, making their teeth ache. "Are we inside it?" Julian asked, his voice barely audible. No one answered. They continued down the corridor in eerie silence, every sound swallowed by the oppressive, almost tangible quiet. Lights on their suits cast sickly, shifting shadows across the walls, revealing glimpses of something that seemed to watch them from the corner of their vision. Faces, eyes, mouths, shapes they couldn't quite identify appeared momentarily before vanishing, leaving them questioning their sanity. At the end of the passage, they found an enormous chamber, and as they stepped inside, the signal intensified. It was no longer a distant rhythm. It had become a part of them, coursing through their veins, filling their minds with visions they couldn't comprehend. The walls of the chamber were etched with symbols and patterns that seemed to move, shifting and warping as they watched, as though alive with some ancient, hungry intelligence. Elliot squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes. They resembled hieroglyphs, alien and horrifying, images of twisted beings writhing in agony, tendrils reaching out as though trying to escape. At the center of the chamber lay an altar, an unsettling organic mass that pulsed in rhythm with the signal, each throb accompanied by an inaudible scream that reverberated through their minds. "It's a shrine," Lyra murmured, transfixed. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and Elliot saw a glimmer of understanding flicker across her features. "Or a prison," Julian replied, his voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. His eyes darted around, his hands clenching and unclenching as though fighting an invisible force. Elliot's mind raced as the signal's meaning began to take shape in his thoughts. They had stumbled upon something far older than humanity, something that had been waiting in the darkness long before their species had ever looked up at the stars. The entity was here, within these walls, breathing, thinking, watching, and they were no longer visitors. They were trespassers. The lights on their helmets flickered, and the temperature in the chamber dropped sharply. Cold breath clouded the air as a presence materialized, something formless yet overwhelming, filling every inch of the room. A sound, a low, guttural growl, echoed through their minds, and each of them felt it, a clawing sensation at the edge of their thoughts, as though the entity were peeling back the layers of their minds. Images flooded their consciousness, alien worlds drenched in darkness, civilizations crumbling to dust under the weight of time, entire star systems devoured by an unstoppable, malevolent force. Elliot felt his sanity fraying as he realized the truth. The entity wasn't simply an intelligence. It was a predator, a god of entropy, existing beyond the limits of their reality, feeding on fear, despair, and destruction. He staggered back, hands clutching his head, but the visions wouldn't stop. He could feel it reaching into him, pulling out his darkest memories, feeding on his fears, twisting them into nightmares that bled into his waking reality. What does it want?" Julian gasped, his voice breaking as he sank to his knees, trembling. "It wants us," Harper replied in a strangled whisper. "Our minds, our fears. It feeds on them." Elliot stared at the altar, realization dawning. The signal had been a lure, a beacon designed to draw them in, to awaken something ancient and insatiable. And now, trapped in the heart of this entity's prison, they were helpless against its power. He felt the entity probe his mind, whispering incomprehensible truths, promises of knowledge, of unity, of transcendence that was anything but human. Their thoughts no longer felt entirely their own. Elliot could feel the edges of his identity slipping, merging with something far larger and darker. He glanced at his crewmates, recognizing the same horror in their eyes, a silent understanding that their minds were unraveling, each of them becoming mere vessels, fragments to be absorbed into the greater whole. Lyra's face twisted, her expression going slack as if she were listening to something only she could hear. She began to murmur softly, her words a string of nonsense in a language none of them knew. She moved toward the altar, hands reaching out in a trance, her eyes vacant, reflecting the pulsing light that throbbed within the organic mass. "Lyra, stop!" Elliot's voice came out hoarse, but it was as if she couldn't hear him. She was gone, a puppet of the entity's will, her mind shattered under the weight of its presence. As she touched the altar, a wave of energy rippled through the room, and the walls seemed to close in, writhing with a life of their own. Elliot heard the whispers intensify, growing louder, more insistent, until they became a single unified voice that spoke directly to them, a voice that was not sound but a feeling, a presence. "You have come to join." The words reverberated in his mind, shattering his last vestiges of resistance. Elliot felt his consciousness slipping, his memories unraveling as the entity consumed him, piece by piece. He could feel himself merging with it, his mind stretching, dissolving into something vast and dark and incomprehensible. His final thoughts were of Earth, of humanity's insignificance, of the folly that had driven them to seek answers in the cold, indifferent void. They had reached too far, stumbled upon something they were never meant to understand, and now they were nothing more than sustenance, moths drawn to a flame that would devour them whole. The entity pulsed, a rhythm of despair and hunger, and in that moment, Elliot understood the truth. This was not a discovery, not an encounter, but a trap, a prison where minds were broken and devoured, one by one, to feed an ancient god of darkness and decay. As his consciousness dissolved, his last fleeting thought echoed through the emptiness, a cry lost in the vast expanse of an uncaring universe. They were never coming back. The silence on the Perseus felt heavier now, oppressive and suffocating, as though the ship itself had become infected with the presence that dwelled within the alien structure. Elliot Klein could feel the difference in the air, a thickness that clung to his skin, invaded his lungs, and echoed in his bones. It was as if the entity had soaked into every inch of the ship, a dark, festering rot spreading through metal and mind alike. For days he wandered the corridors in a daze, lost in nightmares that lingered long after he'd woken, each vision more horrific than the last. It was hard to tell where the nightmares ended and reality began, if they ended at all. His memories of Earth, his own name, even the identities of his crewmates were slipping from him, lost in a haze of whispers and strange visions that played on an endless loop in his mind. Something was unraveling inside him, something he couldn't contain or control. He wasn't the only one. The others had started to change, each retreating into the isolated corners of the ship, murmuring to themselves, scratching at invisible insects crawling along their skin. Julian had stopped talking entirely, his eyes distant as though he were seeing some vision no one else could see. He spent hours staring at the walls of his quarters, his lips moving silently, mouthing phrases in a language Elliot couldn't recognize but somehow understood, a language of despair and entropy, as though he were chanting the dirges of lost worlds. Captain Harper, once the unwavering leader of their mission, had succumbed to a similar fate. She no longer wore her uniform, instead wrapping herself in pieces of fabric she'd torn from her bed, muttering about protection and sanctuary. She'd created symbols on the walls of her quarters, spiraling patterns and twisted shapes that made Elliot's stomach churn when he looked at them too long. She called them wards, scrawled with a frantic determination, convinced they would keep her safe from the presence that had claimed the ship. The worst was Lyra. She had been the first to hear the whispers, and now she wandered the ship like a wraith, her skin pale and bruised, her eyes vacant and hollow. She didn't respond to their voices, barely seemed to eat or sleep. Instead, she drifted between the consoles, leaving cryptic symbols and smears of blood on the screens, her eyes fixed on something beyond the walls of the ship. "They're watching us," she whispered to Elliot one night, her voice thin and distant. Her fingers traced the console in delicate patterns, as though she were writing messages to unseen eyes. "They're learning. They're feeding." Elliot wanted to ask her who they were, but he already knew. The entity had found them, invaded them, and now it was dissecting them piece by piece, consuming their thoughts, devouring their memories, leaving nothing but hollowed shells behind. The signal was inescapable now. It thrummed through the walls, vibrating in his skull, an endless beat that never let up, an incessant rhythm he couldn't shut out. Each pulse twisted his mind a little more, burrowing into his consciousness like a parasite, corrupting his thoughts, tainting his memories with alien visions of ruin and despair. He could no longer tell which memories were his own and which had been planted by the entity. Visions of alien landscapes, barren and lifeless, dead civilizations lost to time, their minds absorbed by the same malevolent force that now held them captive. Elliot's thoughts spiraled, spinning out of control, breaking apart under the relentless assault of the signal. In moments of clarity, he wondered if he was still Elliot at all, or just another voice in the entity's growing chorus of trapped minds, his soul fused with the consciousness of countless others it had consumed over millennia. It was then he noticed the changes in his own body. His hands trembled, his skin looked translucent in the dim light, veins throbbing with a dark hue that seemed to pulse in time with the signal. He was certain that, in the mirror, his reflection was changing too, features blurring, eyes darkening, face hollowing as though the entity were reshaping him, transforming him into something unrecognizable. The crew's communications with each other became incomprehensible. Words dissolved into strange sounds, phrases fractured, sentences twisted into maddening loops. They'd try to speak, only for the signal to take control, warping their voices, transforming them into guttural alien sounds. Paranoia gripped them. The walls of the Perseus became prisons, and each corner of the ship felt like a watchful eye, observing, recording, studying them with a relentless hunger. Julian became erratic, frantically dismantling panels and equipment in a futile attempt to disrupt the signal, muttering about freeing us from it. But even in his panic, he couldn't escape. His fingers bled from wrenching at the panels, his face twisted in desperation, but the more he tried, the stronger the signal grew, as though feeding off his despair, drinking in his suffering. One night, Elliot heard him screaming, a sound that ricocheted through the ship, sharp and raw with fear. By the time he found Julian, he was huddled in the corner of the engine room, his face frozen in terror, staring at his own reflection in a piece of broken glass. They're inside my head, he whimpered, clutching at his skull as though trying to tear the entity out by force. They know everything. They know... His words trailed off into a sob, and Elliot could only watch, powerless as Julian succumbed to the growing madness that had consumed them all. And then came the blackouts. Hours would slip by in an instant. Whole conversations vanished from memory, entire corridors of the ship forgotten as though they'd never existed. Elliot would find himself in unfamiliar places, staring at walls covered in symbols he didn't remember drawing, his fingers smeared with blood that might have been his, or might have been something far older, something left by previous victims of this ancient intelligence. Time became a blur. Days, hours, minutes lost all meaning. The signal was timeless, a force that existed beyond the boundaries of their reality, and in its presence time began to unravel. Elliot could no longer remember the faces of his family on Earth, the sound of their voices, the comfort of sunlight on his skin. Every memory was eroded, replaced by visions of desolate alien landscapes, the last remnants of civilizations that had come before them and fallen to the same fate. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, pulling at him, calling him into the darkest corners of the ship. He found himself drifting towards the airlock, his hands reaching for the controls, his mind filled with a single, overwhelming urge to open the door, to let the void consume him. It was only the faintest glimmer of his former self that held him back, the last remnants of his willpower fighting against the compulsion to throw himself into the blackness. Elliot stumbled back, breathless, as if he'd just escaped something monstrous, something beyond comprehension. But deep down, he knew the truth. The entity wasn't finished with them. It was still there inside their minds, biding its time, savoring their fear and despair. They were nothing more than prey caught in a trap, slowly consumed by a force that thrived on the slow decay of their sanity. As the final shreds of his mind slipped away, Elliot understood that escape was impossible. The Perseus was no longer a ship. It had become a vessel for the entity's will, a prison that would keep them trapped in the darkness forever, their minds absorbed, their identities lost, each of them becoming another voice in the endless, screaming chorus of lost souls. In those final moments, he glimpsed the entity's true form, a presence vast and formless, something older than the stars, a consciousness that stretched across the cosmos, feeding on every mind that dared to seek it out. It was an ancient god of despair, a predator that had been waiting in the dark for eons, and now it had found them, drawn them in, devoured them whole. He felt himself dissolve, his thoughts scattering like dust, his memories fading into the black. The entity reached for him, welcoming him into its void, and he felt his mind unravel, merging with the millions of souls it had claimed over millennia. He was no longer Dr. Elliot Klein. He was nothing. Only the darkness remained. And within that darkness, a single chilling certainty echoed through his disintegrating mind. There is no escape. Elliot felt himself slipping. Time had disintegrated, memories crumbled to dust, leaving only hollow fragments of who he once was. Somewhere in the periphery of his vision, the other crew members drifted like shadows, lost souls tethered by thin strands to a reality that was rapidly fading. He didn't know how long they'd been trapped within the Perseus. Hours, days, weeks, none of it mattered. There was only the darkness now and the steady rhythmic pulse of the entity's signal, growing louder with every beat. The void around them no longer felt like space. It felt like a presence, a vast, omnipotent gaze, watching from every corner, observing, waiting. Elliot's remaining thoughts flickered weakly, whispering futile pleas for escape, for an end. But the entity didn't offer mercy or silence. Instead, it answered his thoughts with more visions, images of alien worlds collapsing into ruin, civilizations reduced to ash, as if to show him the pattern of its eternal hunger. A voice, though not truly a voice, but something that resonated directly in his mind, began to speak. It echoed through the hollow corridors, a deep, guttural sound that bypassed his senses and went straight to his core. You have come, and so you will know. Elliot's heart shuddered, a twisted flicker of fear sparking in his chest, a fragile reminder of his humanity. But the voice continued, pulsing through him, flooding his mind with knowledge he was incapable of understanding. It spoke of ancient cycles, of an existence beyond time, of a universe governed by forces no human could hope to comprehend. The entity spoke of itself as a being that had no beginning and no end, a cosmic predator that devoured not flesh, but minds, consciousness, identities, until there was nothing left but whispers in its infinite void. He caught a glimpse of it then, a mass of writhing tendrils, eyes, mouths, shapes that defied logic and understanding. It was not a creature, but a concept, a force of destruction and despair that had existed since the birth of the stars. It was beyond life, beyond death, a thing made of the purest darkness, a hunger that stretched across galaxies, consuming every spark of light it touched. Elliot gasped as the vision tore through him, ripping apart the last shreds of his mind. He could feel himself unraveling, his thoughts fracturing, pieces of his consciousness breaking away like fragments of glass. He was no longer Dr. Elliot Klein. He was part of something far greater, an endless chorus of lost souls, their screams swallowed by the void. In his final moments, he realized the truth. The entity wasn't just consuming them, it was absorbing everything they had been, every thought, every memory, every fear. Their identities would live on within it, trapped in an eternal cycle of despair and terror, an endless torment that would feed the entity for eons to come. He glanced at the others, Julian, Lyra, Harper, seeing in their eyes the same crushing realization, the same silent plea for an escape that would never come. They, too, had seen the entity's true form, had glimpsed the endless sea of darkness that awaited them. They were prisoners, their minds locked in a cage without walls, floating forever in the vastness of space. In those last moments, Elliot's consciousness faded, his final thoughts dissolving into the entity's endless void. He felt the presence reach into him, prying apart every secret, every memory, every dream, as if savoring his pain, his hopelessness, his utter defeat. And as he slipped into oblivion, he heard the entity's final words, a chilling whisper that echoed across his fading mind. "You are part of me now." The darkness swallowed him whole. Back on Earth, transmissions from the Perseus had long since ceased. The crew had been marked as lost, another failed mission, their names fading from memory as the years passed. Yet, within the silence of deep space, something stirred, a faint, pulsing signal drifting through the cosmos, whispering of despair and horror, of minds broken and devoured. Perhaps it was only static, a faint echo of the countless stars. But if one listened closely, very closely, they might hear the whispers of the crew of the Perseus, calling out from the endless darkness, trapped forever within the grasp of an ancient malevolent force. They were lost, but the entity, ever patient, waited, and soon others would come.